what does a raft of anti-homosexuality bills enacted across the African continent mean for the rights and protection of affected LGBTIQA+ communities? Ugandan lawmakers this week approved a revised anti-homosexuality bill, condemned as possibly being the worst anti-LGBTQIA+ law anywhere, and it subjects gay people to being executed for having consensual sex. Let's welcome to the program Neela Ghoshal, who is the Senior Director of Law Policy and Research at Outright International. Good evening to you and welcome. Do you believe that this is all part of a concerted effort by participating African governments to make the LGBTIQA+ communities disappear, to effectively eliminate their existence?
Yes, thank you for having me on the show, first of all. I do think that it's very concerning that there is a raft of bills materializing in different parts of the African continent. That includes in Uganda, in Kenya, in Ghana, and there have also been statements from politicians in countries like Mali and Niger to the effect that they plan to introduce bills. Recently, a politician in Tanzania also called for even harsher legislation. That's in a country that, like Uganda, already has life imprisonment on the books for consensual same-sex acts. And so it does appear that there is something along the lines of a concerted effort, and we know some of the people who are behind this concerted effort. A few weeks ago, at the end of March, beginning of April, in Uganda, there was a parliamentary conference that was held with the support of a U.S. Extremist religious right group called Family Watch International. And that conference brought together parliamentarians from around the African continent, together with US-based extremists. And they spoke about things like the importance of criminalizing homosexuality even further than it's already criminalized across Africa. So there really does seem to be networking and connecting between these different politicians. And unlike existing laws that mostly criminalize sexual acts, these are laws that really go much further and try to make it illegal or physically impossible to exist as an LGBTQ person in a number of African countries.
It's so interesting, you know, at the heart of all of these are individuals, it is cultures, it is, you know, societal beliefs. External influences like the ones you're mentioning, sure, that's a part of it, but how do you assess and account for the ideologies that drive such laws such as the ones we're talking about?
I think there's a really complicated set of factors that come together to create the strength and the virulence of these ideologies at this time. We know that societies around the world at different times have always singled out groups of people for being different, and have in some cases dealt with those groups of people very harshly. And this ranges from ethnic groups to religious minorities. Right now, it appears that LGBTQ people have become the sort of favored target and scapegoat by a number of African politicians. And there's a kind of confluence of rhetoric around African traditions and African cultures, most of which is not based in evidence, because the reality is that in pre-colonial African cultures, there's substantial evidence that there were always people who were in same-sex relations, people who were gender non-conforming, etc. But there's been this sort of trope pulled out of the idea of this patriarchal, heterosexual African culture that is uniform. So we know this is not true. We know this never has been true, but this is a political tool that's being used at this particular point in time by politicians, in some cases to distance themselves from the West and to assert their own independence and sovereignty. Often it's the case that these are governments that are not delivering. They are not delivering fundamental human rights, and they're also not delivering basics of development to their populations. And so they're looking for a scapegoat, something to distract people.
I think we could have an entire discussion just on that, on what drives these foundational ideologies and what what the fix will be, you know, to try and re-educate people or to reshape how society thinks about these communities. But maybe I can deal with two quick things before we have to leave. How will these laws silence these communities, the LGBTIQA+ communities, but also their friends and families? Because what we are also hearing is that families and landlords can turn queer people out into the streets. If you are an ally or a funder, you can also face the possibility of jail time.
Exactly. And what these bills are trying to do, and I'm speaking specifically about Uganda, where the bill is has just been sent back to President Museveni by Parliament, this horrific bill that includes the death penalty for some consensual acts, but also includes provisions that criminalize the so-called promotion or even the normalization of homosexuality, right? So I'm speaking about Uganda, I'm speaking about Kenya that has a very similar kind of copy and paste bill from Uganda's, and I'm also speaking about Ghana's bill. These three bills in particular make it illegal to speak out on behalf of the LGBTQ community. And so they are attempting to silence the entire population and make sure there is not even any debate on this issue, which is completely contrary to the principles of democracy and essentially a way of shutting down a portion of human rights advocacy. So family members cannot speak up in Uganda if this bill is passed and say, I think it's okay that my son is gay. I think it's okay that my cousin is transgender. That will be illegal. Publicly supporting a queer person and saying that you think it's okay for them to be who they are will be illegal. And this is something that we know is going to be selectively used against human rights advocates, who we know are not popular for many reasons in Uganda and a number of other countries. And it will also be used against anybody else, opposition politicians, anyone else who's out of favor with the government, simply for speaking their mind and for advocating for basic human rights.
Extremely harsh. What we do know, Neela, is that social change takes long. And we have to look at other ways to address this and to get some recourse and protection. You write, as have others, that this is tantamount to genocide, an attempt to destroy a specific group of people. But how does this, in a way, empower the possibility for a case to emerge that can be petitioned in the appropriate courts?
I think it will be very interesting to see if there's a possibility with Uganda's bill, for instance, in terms of finding that this amounts legally to crimes against humanity, and specifically the crime against humanity of persecution. So the argument that I made in a recent essay that I published together with my colleague Wambui Matingi is that this is genocidal thinking that underlies these bills, because it attempts to wipe out a group of people based on their identity in whole or in part. Now, the definition of genocide specifically under international law only applies to racial, ethnic, religious, or national groups. And yet the crime against humanity of persecution can also apply to groups that are targeted because of their gender. And that's inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. So the International Criminal Court, for instance, has determined that persecuting a group of people, if it's grave enough and crosses the line, can be a crime against humanity under international law. And I think that what the Ugandan legislators are doing right now is they are essentially legislating crimes against humanity. And this is something that the legislators in Ghana and Kenya need to be thinking twice about. Do they want to be advocating international crimes that could eventually get them pulled before the International Criminal Court?
Neela Ghoshal, thank you for talking to us tonight and sharing the lived experience of the LGBTQIA+ communities, not only in Uganda, but in other parts of the African continent where these laws are being enacted. She is the Senior Director of Law Policy and Research at Outright International.